It's Adrian again. I thought I'd talk about the theological subject today, or a biblical teaching. I'd like to look at the subject of God's covenants. I've come to realise over the last years that this is an important subject, but it's important for Christians to understand, and it helps us to see how God deals with man. And it also seems to be a subject that has not always been understood, or it's been misunderstood by various theological systems and various forms of teaching over the years. The reason I came into contact with this, first of all, was that I was in contact with Seventh-day Adventists, and I was looking at their teaching, their theology, and I ended up not agreeing with what they teach, but it was the subject of the covenants which helped me to understand why it is that, for example, their keeping of the Sabbath is not something that Christians need to do. God has always entered into relationship with man by means of a covenant. So if God has a people, it's because that people are in covenant relationship with him. And not every covenant that we see in the Bible is the same. There are various different ones with various different features, but they do all seem to have a certain structure. For example, there's always parties to the covenant, God on the one side and an individual or a people on the other side. And then God makes a promise to that particular party that he will bless them, or he'll do something, he'll keep a certain promise to that people or that person. And then the third point is that there are various conditions attached to which the other party has to fulfill. God makes a promise of what he will do, but the people actually have conditions to keep that they must keep in order for God to make his promise come true. And the other point is that there are various signs or seals, which are generally some sort of external thing which may not necessarily seem that significant. Because it's a sign of the covenant, then it is significant. If you think about it, it's sort of a bit like a contract in the modern world. If two businesses enter into a contract with one another, then it's the same thing. There are parties to the contract. There are certain promises that the business partner will keep, for example, to provide certain services or certain products, and then there are conditions that the other must fulfill. For example, they have to pay for it, or they have to provide the necessary conditions, working conditions or so on, and then they will maybe sign it and seal it at the end, say, yes, we agree to this, and that we will adhere to this contract. It's that sort of idea. There are various different covenants in the Bible. One of them is known as the Noahic covenant, I believe, in Genesis chapter 9. God made this covenant when Noah stepped out of the ark. God had destroyed the antediluvian world by the worldwide flood, and then Noah came out of the ark, sacrificed the clean animals to God, and God makes a covenant then. And the parties here are between God. It says God makes a covenant with the world, so it's not with a person here particularly. And his promise is that there will never again be a worldwide flood which will destroy all life on the earth. And in this case, it's an unconditional covenant. God just made this promise that he would never do that again. And the sign that he gives is the rainbow. If you see, so the idea is that if you see the rainbow appearing in the clouds, and you start worrying and thinking, oh no, what's going to happen if the rain doesn't stop and the world be flooded? You can remember that God has given that sign as a promise that he wouldn't destroy the world again by a flood. And he hasn't. Basically, there hasn't been another worldwide flood since that particular time. And the sign of the covenant is an external or ceremonial symbol which may seem insignificant in and of itself, but it is important to God, and if there is a covenant sign that we have to keep, then it's important that we do keep it. The next covenant that we come across is the Abrahamic covenant, God makes a covenant with an individual. In this instance, he called Abraham from the city of Ur, which was a city where they worshipped the moon god or moon goddess. I'm not sure. So they were pagans. They didn't know God, but God called Abraham to be his particular person and to be the father of God's people. And so the covenant here is between God and Abraham, and with his seed later on. That's a significant point, but that is the the parties to the covenant. And his promise is that he'll be the father of many nations. So God made the promise to Abraham that he will be the father of many nations. And it says that Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So that's quoted in the New Testament. But it was also the fact, yes, he believed God, but he was led by God to do certain things. And basically, his faith resulted in the fact that he put his money where his mouth is, which is basically what James says. Faith without works is dead. So Abraham believed God, and then he acted on it. He stepped out. So when God told him to do something, like leave your land, then he did. Because he believed God, he believed that God would keep his promise. And the sign and the seal of the covenant in this case is circumcision, which, as far as we know, wasn't there before. But it was each male child will be circumcised on the 8th day. That was the sign of the covenant, which in itself doesn't seem to be particularly meaningful. It's not a particularly spiritual thing, but it's important because God said this is the sign. And therefore, to be in the Abrahamic covenant, the child had to be circumcised. Question is then, is it important to keep the sign? Well, in Exodus 4, verse 24 to 26, there's an interesting little story which says that God had already called Moses. Okay, Moses was a descendant of Abraham, and therefore he was supposed to be under the Abrahamic covenant. The next covenant hadn't come along yet because, Moses hadn't got to Egypt. And it says that God had called Moses, he sent him to Egypt, and on the way, the angel of the Lord met Moses and wanted to kill him. And then we see that his wife cuts the foreskin of the child and presents it to the Lord. And then God's anger moves away. There's no explanation particularly of this actually in the text. But what it appears to be is that Moses had neglected the sign of the covenant. And that was very, very serious. So serious that God wanted to kill him. So if the sign of the covenant and neglecting the sign of the covenant is that important to God, then surely it must be worth considering. So Moses hadn't circumcised his son, but obviously he told his wife about circumcision because she knew about it. Otherwise, why the reaction? But this was something that had to be done in order for the condition of the Mosaic covenant to be fulfilled. And then Moses carried on and went to Egypt and obeyed God. The next covenant we come across is the Mosaic covenant or the Sinaitic covenant. This is in Exodus. Exodus chapter 20, we read about the covenant. In this case, we have the same pattern: parties, promise, condition, and sign. In this case, the parties are God and the children of Israel. Okay, God had redeemed Israel from Egypt, but they were still just like one big family, weren't they? Basically, they were all the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became Israel. They were not yet a people, but God made them a people by entering into covenant with them and giving them certain promises. And the promise that God made here is that he would give them the land of Canaan for their own land, and they will be a people. They will be his people on the land. The condition was that they received the law, which didn't exist before Sinai. When Abraham obeyed God, then it means that God led him from step to step. He was expected to be moral and to walk before God. It talks about that. And to obey the specific commands that God gave him, but it doesn't say anything about the fact that he kept the Mosaic law. This was something new. And in this law, Jewish rabbis have counted, there are 613 commandments which were given as a condition for them to keep in order for God to keep his side of the bargain and for them to be his people. And the sign that they're given here is they will keep the Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, as a day of rest. So they work for 6 days and rest on the seventh day, and they will be God's people. So, therefore, we have the Mosaic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, which has its parties, its promise and its condition, and the signs of the covenant are circumcision is included in the Mosaic covenant, so circumcision remains, and this can be regarded as the entry sign into the covenant. Okay, the people of God are the Israelites, the children of Israel. There's no choice, they're born into the people of God. On the 8th day, the circumcision follows physical birth, and this is the sign that that child enters into the covenant relationship with God. That's the entry sign. And then the Sabbath is a continuing sign and the renewal ceremony of the covenant. Exodus 31:12 says that God has given the Sabbath to them as a sign of the covenant. It's also, of course, in the Ten Commandments. And this is a new commandment. It didn't exist before the Sinaitic law. God has to explain it to them, how important it is, and that they have to rest on this day. So, therefore, the Mosaic covenant is an earthly covenant with earthly promises and consequences. We see that in Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, there's the listed all the blessings that will come on the people of God if they keep God's covenant, and all the curses that will come upon them if they don't. But they're all temporary. It doesn't talk anything about eternal life, about heaven, about consequences following death. It's all the earthly covenant. The greatest blessing for those that keep the covenant will be that they live long lives in the land, and the greatest curse is they will be expelled from the land and they will be somebody else's slaves in foreign territory. But these of course are earthly consequences. I think I'll finish there and continue on the next video as time's up.